On the topics faith, family and freedom in Cuba, Belgium, Brazil, Congo, UK and all over the USA to crowds from 14 to 40,000. International leadership speaker, trainer and coach. Author of Learn to Raw Leadership, Attitude Hack, Live a More Excellent Life, 5 Battle Strategies of a Victorious Warrior. 2021 President's Lifetime Achievement Award recipient. Founding partner of the John Maxwell team. Toastmaster International Speech Competition semi-finalist. Founder of Tell It Like It Is TV, ThatGuyRocks.com and ThatGuySpeaks.com. Creator of Story Power TV, Transforming Grace TV, and Leading Leaders Podcast. Producer of 4 TV programs and podcasts for Liftable TV and World Trumpet Television as well as multiple social media channels. Please help me welcome J. Loren Norris.
It's really amazing to me how often we have these little micro crises, things that change in our life. And we understand that as these changes are coming, sometimes it's easier to avoid the change than it is to face the change because we don't really like what's coming. I heard a great phrase today in an interview between 2 fellows, and one of them said, it sounds to me like you're willing to break the thermometer to avoid the heat wave. And I thought, what a brilliant analogy for failed leadership. That's what I want to talk about in this episode of Leading Leaders.
Subscribe now for our extensive video library of leadership lessons promoting faith, family, and freedom.
I'm J. Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast, and you probably know as well as I do some of those people who they don't really want to admit that there's a problem, even though the problem is clear to everybody else. It's like the emperor who has no clothes. Everybody else knows the emperor is naked. The entire world is looking and thinking, yep, naked emperor. But the emperor not only is unwilling to admit that the emperor himself has no clothes, he's willing to dispatch anyone who would actually tell him he has no clothes. He's crushing the thermometer because of the heat wave. Now, maybe in your leadership style, in your organization, in your relationships, you don't see it quite as clearly as that. Maybe it's the changes in human resources documents about the labels that you might put on someone, whether it has to do with their relationships or their orientation or their national identity or their religious background. And by labeling them according to the people that they affiliate with, you find that you've created offense. Now, heaven forbid there be truth to the idea that when people label themselves and say, I belong to this group, that the reason that they belong to that group is because they hold similar or the same ideologies, philosophies, operating standards, expectations, worldviews. And because they say, I wear the label of being like X, whatever X is, there's probably some pretty clear indications or expectations that if they adhere to those ideas, those beliefs, those worldviews, if they hold those truths to be self-evident, that it's a really good likelihood they're going to behave just like the other people in that organization. Their membership in, their allegiance to, their alignment with that group of people is a pretty good indicator that, well, that's who you're dealing with. It's kind of like if you're walking across your front lawn and you see this little thing scamper across the lawn, and upon further look, you notice it has this little curly tail and a little stinger at the end of that little curly tail. You probably don't ask a whole lot of questions about, is it possible it's a duck? Well, no, ducks usually don't have a little curly tail with a stinger at the end. Well, maybe it's a frog. No, I've never seen a frog with a stinger. Now, I could be wrong. I haven't been to every place on earth where frogs exist. There may be frogs that have stingers. But in Texas, the majority of those little things that have that little curly tail with a stinger at the end of it, those are called scorpions. And they usually have little crab-like pinchers on the front too, and they will pinch you and they will sting you, and I hear they will even bite you. But the odds are, if you see one of those little things, you don't want to label it, mislabel it, characterize it, set expectations around it being a cuddly pet. Not such a good cuddly pet. It's not the kind of critter that you want to be embracing on a cold, dark night. Not a scorpion. No more than a boa constrictor. Now, I do know there are people who keep them as pets. And so you could look at a scorpion and put a label, pet, on it, or a boa constrictor, or for whatever logic it holds, a crocodile or an alligator. Yes, I know people who have had them for pets. I used to have a roommate who had a 6-foot boa constrictor as his pet. Didn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but that's what he had. Personally, I prefer furry things like dogs and cats. But labeling it isn't the problem, is it? I mean, if you call a scorpion a bunny long enough, does it change its nature? No, not really. If you call a scorpion a bunny long enough, does it become harmless? No, not really. Mislabeling, unintentionally changing the label of something or someone or some category of someone's, doesn't make them any less harmless. It doesn't change their character. It doesn't change their worldview. It doesn't change the who that they are. It simply changes your perception of reality. Maybe even, to go a step further, changes your perception of the truth. And we've all worked with organizations that have an issue with annual goals, financial goals usually. In a sales organization, there are some standards that are set that say, this is what we did last year, and so this year we need to raise that by 2, 5, 10, 15%, whatever that number is. And when we look at our overall budget, then we have to at least meet the budget. We've got to at least meet the goals that we had last year to cover the expense increase for this year. And so let's take that number times 10% or 15%. And here's the worst thing for a sales team to do, to begin to look at this metric as the end of the year and say, okay, well, that means by the end of the year we will have achieved X amount of sales. And so in order for us to do that, we've got to break that down by the month, by the week, by perhaps the day by the sales rep. And so that means every sales rep has to achieve this number of goal, wherever they were last year, or whatever their gross number was last year. Every day they've got to achieve this goal. And so we need to see where they are on the path. If we find ourselves halfway through the year and half of our reps haven't met half of their goal, the odds the organization is going to meet its goal are like 0. Do we then change the goal? Do we look back at the number and say, well, obviously we're not going to meet that, so let's just modify that expectation so that we can label what we actually accomplish as a goal reached? Now, how often have you been part of an organization where that's the case? Maybe it's the number of people you need to hire. It's the number of people that you need to train. It's the number of opportunities that you need to seek out. The number of phone calls that you have to make to dial for dollars to create new opportunity. Maybe it's the books that have to be read, the students who have to be taught, the tests that have to be taken. Maybe it's the number of tests that have to be passed. And oh yeah, this happens in public education on a regular basis where they have a standardized test. In fact, about a decade or two ago, they started this process of saying, based on the number of students in your school who can pass the standardized test at a certain level, your school will be evaluated as to a high-performing school or a low-performing school based on the number of students in your school that pass the tests. Now, that change was almost like saying, we're going to repaint the thermometer, because what we don't want to do is change the way we educate the kids necessarily, or we don't want to ask the question, are the standardized tests actually giving us a barometer, a true reading of the temperature of the education level that our kids are getting? If they're taking test A versus test B, do we really know if they're any smarter or not? Have they actually learned anything? Are they smarter than kids in other schools? And so that's why the standardized test became the thing. We got to ask them all the same questions or thereabouts. We've got to test their ability and their knowledge across the board so that we know if people in that school, in that town, have exactly the same knowledge, understanding, and awareness as the ones right here. But when you take the test, and some students are great test takers, and some students are not great test takers, when you take the test, and some students have had a teacher who's really focused on current events, or really focused on teaching math, or really focused on teaching history, and not teaching the content and the questions of the standardized test, then you may have students who are intelligent, who have great A and B scores, but the minute they take the test, they look like they're from another planet. Well, what is the purpose of that? Well, the purpose of that is conformity, but the result of that is you look like your classroom full of highly intelligent, highly educated, self-thinking students can't pass a standardized test. And they can't pass the standardized test because they're not conformists. They're not surrendering their entire day to taking that test. I know I had this conversation with my mother for many, many years while she worked in the public school system, and she had those students that many of them had already been abandoned by the school district with discipline issues or truancy issues or can't pass the grade issues, and they would get shoved into her classroom, and she had these students with all A honor rolls. Many of them went on to get scholarships, but they did horribly on the standardized test. They passed the academic fields that were necessary for their graduation, but they did horrible on the standardized test. And when she was called to the carpet for it, many of her superiors said, "Why don't you just teach the test?" She said, "Because in my opinion, that's not an education." That's kind of pointing at the emperor with no clothes on. And I can tell you, throughout history, there have been those who have paid very high prices, emotionally, relationally, vocationally, sometimes with their freedom and sometimes with their life, for simply going, "That emperor's naked." I mean, just noticing can put you in harm's way. But to actually say it out loud, yeah, you're really bringing down a heap of coals on your head. They really prefer that you not even notice that the emperor has no clothes on. But if you notice, then keep it to yourself. Don't tell anybody else in the world. Heaven forbid everybody realize the emperor has no clothes on. Because there are those involved in the emperor having no clothes on, and it may not even be the emperor, who have a vested interest in the world, mocking and laughing silently at the emperor with no clothes on. I won't even draw out the analogy of current leadership around the world because it's just too obvious. But I will say that even within an organization where a leader, whether they're measuring performance reviews of personalities and how they interact, or they're measuring sales goals, or they're measuring hiring goals, or they're measuring standards against the industry and whether or not we're keeping up with safety protocols and production limits and all of the environmental expectations for us to produce what we produce. Those are all thermometers of their own. They're all thermometers within the realm of that job, that industry, that profession. I had a client for a long period of time who was a pediatrician. And one of her greatest frustrations was, as the scoring systems were being overlaid with the local clinics and hospitals, she was told you only get 17 minutes with each patient. In order for our hospital to remain profitable, we've got to move people through at a certain clip. I know, I still go see my VA clinic on a regular basis about once every 90 days, and I can see her looking at her watch as we're having a conversation, catching up on what's been going on in my world and in hers. And she'll look at her watch, she's like, "I've got to get on to the next patient." Because they're booked, they're stacked that close together, and there's an expectation. It's a thermometer. It's a measurement tool. It's designed to tell you what you don't already know, or at least to point out, like the alarm when your timer goes off on your microwave or your oven, to say, "It's done, take it out, it's all finished, you've reached the limit." Well, see, the same kind of problem happens in our personal relationships and even internally. But we miss these. It's real easy as a leader to have those standard operating procedures, those targeted sales goals, those targeted hiring goals, those targeted training goals, even those environmental standards to say we are within OSHA's expectations, we're within the EPA's expectations, we are doing what we're supposed to do, and we're doing it the way we're supposed to. We've met all those standards, and there's a nice little barometer or thermometer on the wall to remind you what those things are. But what about the ones internally? What about the self-evaluations? What about those questions about your own integrity, your own morality, your own considerations? The ones that nobody else can see. They're not posted on the wall for everyone to look at and go, oh, we're that far from the goal. Or, oh, we've already achieved the goal. No, these standards that you have to set for yourself as a leader, there's nobody watching those but you. See, this is worse than the emperor has no clothes on, because when the emperor has no clothes on, at least there's a court of people who understand the emperor has no clothes on. Do we guard him? Do we protect him? Do we at least make sure that no one says anything about it? But when these standards are internal, when these measurement tools are yours and yours alone, it's really easy to break the thermometer. It's really easy to change the standards, to reset the goals, to change the parameters of measurement, to not measure at all. It's really easy to say, well, I've already won. Have you ever played a game against yourself? I started when I was 18 or 19 years old playing billiards, pool, 8-ball, 9-ball. When I started, it was in an apartment complex that I lived in. And since I worked nights, there were days that I would get up at noon and I would have 5 or 6 hours before I had to go to work. And I would literally sit up in the clubhouse all by myself, knocking the pool balls around, figuring out trick shots and learning things. Now, there was a guy who worked maintenance there who was actually a former tournament player at a very high level. He was really, really good. And he taught me a lot. It wasn't long before I was able to beat everybody that I played with on my level based on how long I'd been playing. And then I started playing competitively in tournaments. When I got into the military, most of the fire departments had a pool table in one of the rec rooms inside the fire department. And when you're on a 24-hour shift and you've already finished everything that has to be done, like washing the trucks and doing your training, there's a lot of downtime. Most people would spend that sitting in the rec room watching TV or talking on the phone to their significant others. I would go to the pool hall. I would sit there in that room all by myself. And it's really easy when you play pool by yourself to cheat. I'm going to put the 4-ball in the pocket, and I shoot the 4-ball, and it touches 3 other balls on the way, and I think to myself, do I now shoot stripes, or do I keep shooting the solids because even though I hit the 4-ball and it went in a pocket, it was the wrong pocket and it wasn't a clean shot? Is that a win or is that not a win? That's a really simple to see illustration of cheating yourself, but how many people do it with, I don't know, their diet, their exercise plan? I mean, we're 7 months into a new year, right? Is it even a new year still? It's 2023. How many of you have resolutions that you gave up on 6 weeks into January? How many of you had goals that you set for yourself financially or in a way of discipline, that you're going to exercise, you're going to eat better, you're going to have better relationships, you're going to read more books, you're going to spend more time with your family, you're going to spend more time out in the fresh air? And all of those things, 7 months into the year, should have had a thermometer of some sort that you could look at and go, yep, I'm on target. Or, I kind of missed that one, I need to put a little more effort in there. See, this self-discipline, this self-evaluation, this self-awareness, it's a different set of thermometers. And unless you're the type who's willing to say to your friends, to your accountability partners, to the people around you, I need you to help me stay responsible. I need you to point out when you feel like I'm slipping on those things that I should have paid more attention to. I need you to help me look at this thermometer and look where I'm at right now and ask yourself, why do you have another chocolate cupcake in your hand if you're on a diet? See, it's friends that are allowed to speak into your life when they know you have a barometer or a thermometer and you're not keeping up to your own expectations. Do you have friends in your life that you allow to remind you when you have no clothes on? Who are willing to speak up and say to you, Yeah, that's not what you said you wanted to accomplish this year. That's not the who that you said you wanted to be this year. You haven't written a single word of that book you were starting on this year. You haven't read a single word of that book you said you were going to finish this year. Where are you on this timeline? As a leader, do you have that kind of accountability partners? Because as a leader, you must know, and you must practice, that crushing the thermometer doesn't stop the heat wave. You can't just blame the sun. You can't just blame the heat and the high pressure zones and the wind and the wildfires in another state. I listened yesterday to a politician who talked about the storms opening up over her state and dumping record snows. And then the storms opening up over her state, the skies opening up over her state and allowing the wildfires of Canada to dump their fog and smoke into her state. And then the skies opened up and dumped rain onto her state. 1,000-year rain. It's never rained like this before, ever. And without regard for the emergencies that need to be dealt with, the families who are in crisis, the homes that have been flooded or washed away or buried in snow or damaged by the smoke, in her mind, the culprit was the sky. But the sky hadn't accomplished, and that is everybody who's not concerned about climate change. And so her entire speech, asking for money, asking for help, asking for declarations, was a smashing of the thermometer. It wasn't, here's the problem we're dealing with now. Here's how many people need a new home or need their home rebuilt or need emergency funds to survive until they can get their home rebuilt or somebody to help light a fire under the insurance companies to expedite that process. No, it was none of that. It was all of you around the world who are not contributing to solving the global warming crisis. You are the reason the skies are opening over my state, and you are to blame. If that's not crushing the thermometer, at best it's burying it. It's moving it somewhere else. It's hiding it with some duct tape. It's painting it a different color. It's not looking at the real problem and evaluating it. I find that leaders who are willing to be self-aware, to look at themselves, to look at their own thermometer, to look at their own measure of expectation and excellence and say, I personally am responsible when my life doesn't measure up. I'm responsible when my expectations are unmet. I'm responsible when things need to change, and I'm the one that has to change them. And because I have not covered up or smashed the thermometer, I can look at where we are objectively and say, we're not measuring up, we need to do better. I'm not measuring up, I need to do better. I need to spend more focused time on reading or writing or studying or preparing or whatever it is. And it's on me. Nobody else is going to do my push-ups for me. Nobody else is going to read the books I need to read or write the books I need to write or speak the things I need to say. No one else will do that for you. If you think I'm exaggerating, go back and read Bonhoeffer. If you think I'm exaggerating, look at the condition of society today and ask yourself, how many times can we change the labels of scorpions before scorpions no longer do what scorpions do? How often can we label an organization, a group of people, a mindset, a worldview with a nicer, fluffier label, changing the thermometer, crushing the thermometer, and expecting them to become what we call them rather than becoming what they are? Sure, you can make a pet out of a scorpion if you want to. Chances are, it's still going to sting you. It's in his character. I'm Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast, or Tell It Like It Is TV. Have a blessed day.
Loren is a master teacher on storytelling, and I learned so much. I'm really going to have to sit down and go back through everything, and I think I might have to have some more coffees with Loren, but it was totally worth my time, and I really highly recommend it if you're looking to grow your ministry, grow your business, grow your career. Loren will serve you well.